Reduced to its bare plot, Moby Dick is a rather simple and straightforward story. The narrator joins a whaling expedition that the captain of the ship turns into his personal vendetta against a vicious white whale that mutilated him during an earlier encounter. After searching the seas of the world, they finally find and fight the whale. It manages to destroy the ship, and only the narrator survives. This is pretty much how the story is related on 200 pages in a book aimed at young boys that I read when I was younger and that I recently came across again at my parents' house. Tomorrow, Anna Wilbacher will tell us more about how adaptations for younger readers changed the original text, to which my summary does of course not do justice. When not stripped to its bare plot, the novel is much more than just a tale of adventure. In fact, what exactly it is and what it all means is impossible to pin down, as the text changes under one's eyes constantly. The novel participates and borrows from all kinds of genres. Its narrative situation, quite conventional in the first chapters, is far from stable, and its cast of major and minor characters considerable and complex. All this makes Moby Dick a highly ambiguous text that allows for and even requires a multitude of different approaches and readings, as many of the papers delivered over the next 3 days will show. My talk today will focus on one of these ambiguities, Ishmael's attitude towards whaling. That is, the hunting, killing, and processing of these animals, which both fascinates and appalls him. More specifically, what I would like to suggest is that whaling figures in the novel both as a heroic endeavor, as the brave fight of courageous men against a mighty beast that follows in the steps of a long line of historical and mythical whale hunters, and as the slaughter of rather helpless animals whose bodies are needed and exploited for business. Whaling was an integral part of the capitalist global order at the time, the novel is said. Whale oil lit the homes of people and greased the machines responsible for the swift industrialization of the Western world. Ahab's hijacking of the whaling expedition thus disrupts this order. It is literally bad for business. Ishmael, as I wish to argue, prefers the old ways, but his preference is far from straightforward, as he also revels in the significance of whaling for the global economy. His ambivalence towards the emerging capitalist order of the antebellum period thus aligns him with another famous narrator of Melville's, who at first sight seems to have nothing to do with Ishmael, just as the story he appears in could on the surface not be further removed from Moby Dick. The narrator I am referring to is the unnamed lawyer of the short story Bartleby the Scrivener, which was published in Putnam's Magazine in 1853, that is, 2 years after Moby Dick had come out in 1851. Whereas the novel Moby Dick is extremely long, convoluted, and populated by many characters, Bartleby is as a short story is supposed to be. It is brief, focuses only on a few characters, and especially the relationship between the narrator and the eponymous hero, and covers a limited amount of time. And yet, as I wish to demonstrate, both narrators display a similar ambivalence towards the new capitalist order whose triumph both texts ultimately represent as inevitable. However, while the narrator in Bartleby ultimately looks forward and embraces this new order, Ishmael looks rather backward. Even though Moby Dick is the earlier text, I will begin here with Bartleby. Not only for dramatic purposes, that is, to build toward the text our symposium is all about, but also because it is easier to identify the changes in labor organization and labor relations that were occurring in the United States at the time through the short story. Bartleby the Scrivener, as most of you surely know already, is the story of a successful lawyer, the story's homodiegetic narrator, whose business is going so well that he hires another copyist. That is, another assistant who will help with the tedious task of copying by hand legal documents. The person he hires is a young man named Bartleby, who at first appears to be the perfect employee. He is calm and compliant, and unlike the 2 other copyists, Turkey and Nippers, he seems to have no problematic personal habits that would negatively affect his work performance. At first, Bartleby did an extraordinary quantity of writing. As if long famishing for something to copy, he seemed to gorge himself on my documents. There was no pause for digestion. He ran a day and night line, copying by sunlight and by candlelight. I should have been quite delighted with his application, had he been cheerfully industrious. But he wrote on silently, palely, mechanically. In other words, Bartleby works like a copy machine. And like such a machine, he is placed in a corner of the lawyer's office, hidden from view by a folding screen but constantly available. If the lawyer was firmly rooted in the new order of things, he should be perfectly happy. That he isn't, that he wishes Bartleby were, as he puts it, cheerfully industrious, shows that he does not yet fully embrace the new capitalist mode of production that hinges on a strict separation of work and private life. His ambivalence also explains why he doesn't get rid of Bartleby faster when the scrivener stops doing his work, using his signature phrase, "I would prefer not to," but refuses to vacate the office space even after the narrator has fired him. As among others, Sean Whelans has argued, the antebellum period, the decades from the 1830s to the Civil War, saw a significant transformation in labor relations. A shift from an artisanal mode of production to a, as one might be tempted to say, properly capitalist one. Under the old order, the master and his employees, journeymen as well as apprentices, were bound by a system of mutual obligations. They worked closely together and often even lived together. The workers' quarters were next to or even part of the shop, or they were even considered part of the master's household. Accordingly, there was no strict separation between private life and public work. Over the course of the antebellum period, however, this slowly changed, and work relations as we still know them today began to emerge, and with them an increasingly strict separation between the private and the public, between work and life. Many critics have read the story against this background, but they have arrived at very different conclusions. For David Kubrick, for example, quote, "Working conditions in the law office mirror the rapid space hierarchical division of labor and impersonality characteristic of the larger shop and factory that were replacing the traditional artisanal shop," unquote. And he adds, "The lawyer knows little about the lives of his clerks." By contrast, Michael Gilmore argues that the lawyer, who stresses that he is quite old at the very beginning of the story, is still firmly rooted in the old order. Quote, "The lawyer cheerfully puts up with his employees' eccentricities," unquote, with the fact that Turkey only does good work in the morning and Nippers only in the afternoon. As Gilmore puts it, the lawyer, quote, "tends to think of them in personal terms rather in terms of money," end of quote. What I would like to suggest, and what I already hinted at earlier, is that, as so often, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The lawyer wants his business to be successful and cares a lot about his reputation. But he also still wants a personal relationship to his employees. Put pointedly, he wants them to be copying machines, but happy ones. As long as he can accommodate their peculiarities without hurting his business too much, he acts accordingly. Instead of firing Turkey and Nippers and hiring somebody who performs well not only half of the time in their stead, he hires Bartleby as an additional copyist. When Bartleby stops doing his work but refuses to leave the office, the lawyer moves his office to a new building. Only when the new tenant of the old office space complains because Bartleby is still lingering there, does the lawyer finally have Bartleby arrested and removed. Tellingly, when the new tenant demands that the lawyer take care of Bartleby, he initially replies, "The man you allude to is nothing to me. He is no relation or apprentice of mine that you should hold me responsible for," unquote. But equally tellingly, when the lawyer undertakes a final effort to resolve the situation without the police, he offers to take Bartleby in at his home. Sorry. "Bartleby," said I in the kindest tone, "I could assume under such exciting circumstances, will you go home with me now? Not to my office, but my dwelling, and remain there till we can conclude upon some convenient arrangement for you at our leisure. Come, let us start now, right away." Gilmore argues that the narrator treats Bartleby exactly as one would have treated an apprentice, but that is not quite accurate. What the lawyer is doing is to sever the work relationship from the personal one. If Bartleby came to live with the lawyer, he would no longer be his employee, but a purely private project that is difficult to name. But this never comes to pass anyway, as Bartleby refuses once again and the lawyer has him arrested. He visits him in prison once more, but when he comes to see him again, Bartleby has died. The lawyer remains preoccupied with Bartleby, which is why, many years later, he tells the story. But when push came to shove, he put his business first at the expense of his former employee and their personal relationship, which he is unable to sustain without their work relationship. Reluctantly, but in the end, nevertheless clearly, he embraces the new order of work relations and leaves the old one behind. Of course, whaling was also affected by the transformations of the economy that are negotiated in Bartleby, albeit differently. Cesare Cesarino has analyzed in much detail how the story of the Pequod's hunt for the white whale dramatizes tensions in the transition from mercantile to industrial capitalism, a shift that largely corresponds to the shift from artisanal to new labor relations in the short story. What is more, during the 1840s, when the novel is set, the whaling industry reached its peak. Ships were constantly improved and so were processing techniques, and at no time was more whale oil processed than during the 1880s. What remains is the impression of whales behaving like cattle, an impression even further corroborated when Ishmael claims that the milk of female whales, quote, is very sweet and rich, it has been tasted by men, it might do well with strawberries, unquote, and thus likening it to cow milk. Killing cattle is not at all heroic, but all part of the job. It only gets dangerous if one needlessly provokes the animals. This is why Starbuck, the novel's chief voice of utilitarianism, only, quote, scratches their backs with his lance, unquote, while they are surrounded by them, quote, but fearful of the consequences for the time refrains from darting it, end of quote. And this is also why he gets angry with Flask when he needlessly torments the old whale that the crew kills earlier in the novel. As Armstrong argues, humane Starbuck, in his attempt to stop Flask's tormenting of the infirm whale during the incident cited above, is both practically and economically rational. Flask's sadism endangers the crew as it counterproductively agitates the tormented animal and mirrors his distaste for unprofitable heroism. End of quote. Starbuck's focus on profits, on the economic goal of the voyage, is the main reason why he initially objects to Ahab's plan to hunt down Moby Dick. "How many barrels will thy vengeance yield thee if thou gettest it, Captain Ahab?" he asks. But as we all know, he eventually fails in challenging Ahab's authority and falls in line with the latter's plans for unprofitable heroism. And so does, much more quickly and easily, we could say, our narrator, Ishmael. To be sure, Ishmael is not at all opposed to whaling as part of an increasingly globalized capitalism. In one of the more nationalistic chapters of the novel, The Advocate, he celebrates the US whaling industry for its size and global impact. He is proud that whales killed by American whalers light the world and grease the machines that drive industrialization. Personally, he is also unhappy when Captain Bildad offers him a ridiculously small amount of the ship's profits as wage, but before he can protest, Captain Peleg comes to his aid. Whereas the narrator of Bartleby is not completely averse to the old artisanal order of things, Ishmael is not so firmly opposed to the new order of things as one might sometimes suspect. And yet, Ishmael's main motivation is not to make money or to help keep the whaling industry going. Although he tells us in the second sentence of the novel that he took the decision to go whaling, quote, having little or no money in his purse, unquote, he is not doing it for profits, but to, quote, drive off the spleen and regulate the circulation, unquote. Since there is, quote, nothing particular to interest him on shore, unquote, he decides to go to sea in what is clearly a quest for meaning. And this meaning is not provided by the cash cow of the modern whaling industry, but by the whale as the Leviathan of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the older tradition Armstrong refers to in the passage quoted earlier. Whereas the cash cows of the herds are only good for slaughter, the solitary white whale that the Pequod pursues is imbued with meaning, shifting, complex, and contradictory meanings that run counter to the straightforward logic of investment and profit of the capitalist regime. This is why Ishmael does not only explore what Moby Dick means to Ahab, but why he also devotes a whole chapter, the famous The Whiteness of the Whale, to the exploration of what, quote, at times he was to me, unquote. And this is why he devotes so much space to the memory of the ancient tradition of whaling, to the Huns of pre-industrial times when the battle between man and beast was still more heroic. And this is also why he falls in line much faster than Starbuck when Ahab tries to win the crew over for his revenge. Ahab's hunt for the white whale constitutes, as Starbuck recognizes, much better than anybody else, a disruption of the capitalist order. It involves a risky investment, the ship and its whole crew, that is by no means justified by what the killing of Moby Dick would yield in terms of economic value. But this is not what Ahab is interested in anyway, and thus Starbuck's question, how many barrels will thy vengeance yield if thou gettest it, is beside the point. Ahab's vendetta is not about value or surplus value. He is not after a cash cow, but after symbolic value, after a Leviathan and what he stands for. As Philip Armstrong reminds us in another article on Moby Dick, the 1840s and 1850s saw, quote, a proliferation of stories about fighting whales, which betrayed the anxiety of globalizing industrial capitalism towards the animal nature upon which it depended, but which sometimes resisted or escaped its control, unquote. In other words, what is ultimately at stake then in the novel is the anxiety that a cash cow turns into a Leviathan and disrupts the capitalist exploitation. Of course, such a disruption can only ever be temporary, as the subversion of the capitalist logic by the rogue captain. The Pequod and its crew are lost for the economy at the end of the story, but the whaling industry can't be stopped by beast or man. It only went into decline when a cheaper and less dangerous source for oil was detected, one that would not tear off limbs off those harvesting it, petroleum. What we are left with then, at the end of Bartleby and Moby Dick, are two narrators who live on to tell their tales. But as is typical of Melville's writing, which is full of ambivalences and contradictions, their stories are far from straightforward. The lawyer is looking forward rather than backward, and with Ishmael it's the other way around. But it is impossible to tell where Melville himself stood on these issues. It is, of course, tempting and sometimes also fashionable to consider him critical of these developments, embracing Ishmael's position and rejecting the lawyers. But we also know that he was hurt by the fact that his books from Moby Dick onward did not really find readers and thus did not really make money. It may therefore be best to assume that his position was as contradictory as the ones of the narrators discussed here today. We simply cannot know for sure. Thank you.
Before approaching to Ahab's madness as an epitome of antebellum America's asabia or group feeling and a deferred allegory of the demonic reason as the backdrop of self-righteous imperium of the United States, I would like to talk briefly about Ibn Khaldun's definition of the term. Ibn Khaldun is a 14th century Arab sociologist, philosopher, and historian. In his Muqaddimah, introduction to his 1344 book called Kitabul Iber, he developed the term asabiya as group feeling. According to him, earliest mode of an asabiya or group feeling was based on kinship and blood-related communities. Concerned with the atavistic evocation of pre-Islamic pagan mindset, Islam denounced asabiya due to its potentiality for bias of one community over another. Khaldun was aware of this negative usage of the term, and instead of the earlier formula of asabiya based on kinship, he emphasized the general usage of the term and asserted that asabiya or group feeling was an indispensable process for the shaping of communities and their projected nations. Nevertheless, quote, preponderance of asabiya renders one group superior to others. It also determines leadership within a given group. and no group can retain its predominance nor any leader his dominant position in the group when their former asabiya is no longer there to support them. In Haldun's view of history, according to which the whole world and everything in it depends upon man, there is no room for an abstract concept of the state. The state exists only insofar as it is held together and ruled by individuals and the group which they constitute. Therefore, in the absence of asabiya, the state being identical with it also comes to an end. As an example of Haldun's formulation of group feeling for the shaping of communities and their projected nations, Herman Melville's Moby Dick exemplifies the devastating outcomes of grouping around bias-shaped ideas and aggression as that of Captain Ahab's. In order to highlight similarities between sperm whale fishery and other developing industries whaling helped thrive in the antebellum America, Captain Ahab's ship, the Pequod's ventures are likely that of America as a territorially manifesting nation. In chapter 14, called the Nantucket, Ishmael introduces the ancient Nantucket tribe as pioneers of whale hunting in North America and asserts that whale hunters are like emperors, quote, and thus have these naked Nantucketeers, these sea hermits issuing from their anthill in the sea, overrun and conquered the watery world like so many Alexanders, parceling out among them the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, as the three prior powers did in Poland. Let America add Mexico to Texas and pile Cuba upon Canada. Let English overswarm all India, hang out their blazing banner from the sun. 2/3 of this terracotta globe are the Nantucketeers. For the sea is his, he owns it, as emperors own empires, other seamen having but the right way through it, unquote. Moby Dick was published when the massive waves of European migration were intensifying the eastern seaboard cities, and Western expansion and slavery issue were rising the tension between contemporaneous priorities and early Republican principles. The concept of frontier was of paramount significance for the antebellum era and all throughout the 19th century. It not only drew fault lines between the contesting regional political testimonies, but also legitimized the territorial expansion, encroaching on the territorial domains of native tribes and surrounding European colonial powers. A self-righteous rhetoric of expansionism, Manifest Destiny, came out as an idea that the United States was destined to deliver her exceptional democracy towards intra- and extraterritorial boundaries. Indeed, the consent on the imperial impetus of America was inherited from the colonial beginnings. The initial circumnavigating voyages and the discovery of the New World had a lasting impact on the Western mind. While the geographical explorations of the 15th century were progressing, transatlantic voyages transformed the concept of borderline in the West. In a likely progress from the initial attempts of English settler colonialism onwards towards revolutionary and antebellum America, the notion of frontier persisted in the minds of pioneers through their everlasting territorial expansion until the close of the frontier by 1900. Early English settlers' sense of frontier was generated by the fear of immediate destruction and death by the surrounding native tribes and European colonials. Thus, from the very beginning, they had to develop an in-group feeling of a close-knit social structure. Here is a lithograph illustrating the centennial progress of the United States. We have the image of Declaration of Independence at left and the Emancipation Proclamation at right, surrounded by articles of varying sizes in commemoration of the United States Centennial Exhibition held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1876. Here we have each historic text with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln's portraits framed by oak and olive branches. The articles include historical scenes, depictions of battles, portrayals of monuments. So all these images contribute to the whole scene, featuring the seals of each of the 13 original colonies, spelling out the centennial with an American eagle in the middle, in the center, at the center, sorry. Nevertheless, these imageries of early revolutionary Republican spirit, technological advancement, and military power that enhanced territorial expansion reproduce a monolithic view of the new nation, highlighting its exceptionality. In a likely manner, with early colonial accounts of America by English settlers, who who eliminated the entirety of the colonial enterprise by other Europeans and existing native populations. Such mainstream depictions of frontier experience discriminated the existence of a long-established inter-imperial nexus in the continent. Thus, in Cameron Strong's verse, the quotes, the US expansion entailed incorporating lands and peoples that had long been part of other empires. During the process of westward expansion, Spain, France, and Britain were the empires that the US was competing for power. Unlike Spain, France, and Britain, the United States was a republic in which citizens, not a monarch, were the sovereign. But the Republican political organization in no way prevented the early United States from doing the imperial things that other imperial powers did. Far from marking a clean break between colonial and national periods, the US rule perpetuated and sometimes intensified many of the same sort of practices, relationships, and hierarchies previously introduced by European powers, unquote. Given this outlook of imperial relations following the territorial expansionism, towards transcontinental borders, extraterritorial prospects of the US was identified with this notion of imperium in imperio. This is a Spinoza term indeed, suggesting that the natural state was a priority before human beings managed to control it and start to rule over it. However, it also expresses that the human beings can rebuild their own domains of freedom within already existing territorial areas. Regarding this backdrop of America's imperial impetus, Ahab appears as a perfect match for a leader with asabiya. Disguising his vengeance, he keeps silent for a long while, meanwhile sustaining his sultanic rule over his crew. His promise of Spanish gold enchants the crew and encourages their aggression against Moby Dick. Absurdity of their dreadful scheme unfolds with their first lowering when they face the risk of death. Nevertheless, the Pequot sets sail as a replica of a technically advanced, complex society. In the chapter called The Tri-Works, Ishmael's description of the arrangement and efficiency of the tri-works and crew in charge of boiling the whale fat is that of a typical industrial process, whereas Pequot seems a perfect vehicle under the command of Ahab. Quote, as the wind howled on and the sea leaped and the ship groaned and died, and yet steadfastly shot her red hell further into the blackness of the sea and the night, and scornfully camped the white bone in her mouth, and viciously spat around her on all sides. Then the rushing Pequot, frightened with savages and laden with fire and burning corpse, and plunging into that blackness of darkness, seemed the material counterpart of her monomaniac commander's soul, unquote. With such descriptions towards the end, Ishmael's vision becomes clear as the aura of the ship is darkened with the hellish streams. Quote, so seemed to me as I stood at helm, and for long hours silently guided by way of this fire ship on the sea. Wrapped for that interval in darkness myself, I but better saw the redness, the madness and ghastliness of others, unquote. As we see, Ishmael's initial democratic assumptions and rhetoric in the beginning chapters he projected onto whaling seem to fail with his awareness of Ahab's monomaniac sultanism towards the end. The dark agenda of Ahab is indeed identical with the condemned ethos of the kings in the Hebrew Bible. Biblical Ahab is pronounced as the worst of kings, but he himself was among the chosen and sanctified kings in lineage with Saul, David, and Solomon. Thus, in the books of Samuel and Kings, King Ahab's evil character is the one that was prophesied by God, who assigned kings for ruling the human beings on their demand for having mortal kings. This is from first book of Samuel, chapter 8, quote, they said to Samuel, you are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, quote, listen to all that people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, unquote. Thus, Melville's elaboration on sense of evil in referring to both biblical Ahab and Captain Ahab is associated with a peculiar sense of evil and goodness. Sanctified and condemned as the biblical Ahab, Captain Ahab's infidelity drives him mad because of his self-assured immortality, and it leads to his vengeance. till the end. As the last example for the imperial continuities of the post-revolutionary America, the naming of the Pequot can be considered as an implication of the hidden history of the Native American enslavement in colonial periods. Following the Pequot War and King Philip's War, remaining native populations were sent to the offshore colonies as slaves in exchange of African slaves. Regarding Melville's naming of the whaling ship, Van de Warren's remarks on the connection between colonial and revolutionary America are noteworthy. Quote, more than 2 centuries later, when Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, he named the monomaniacal Captain Ahab's ship based in Nantucket the Pequot. Ishmael, the enigmatic narrator, explained the name briefly. Pequot, you will no doubt remember, was the name of a celebrated tribe of Massachusetts Indians, now extinct as the ancient Medes. Of course, Melville was wrong about the extinction. Indians did not disappear from New England, and this is not a story of vanishing Indians. Many remained and fought and survived, and some thrived, but Melville's intended parallel is clear. Like the tribe, the ship suffered from the consequences of single-minded acquisitiveness, and though Melville or Ishmael erred in his belief that Pequots were made extinct by war, he understood quite well how much suffering could derive from being in the way of fanaticism, spiritual and material. The final scene of Moby Dick describes the Pequot sinking in the equatorial waters of the Pacific, the last part of it visible being the hand of Tashtego, an Indian harpooner from Martha's Vineyard, an island just south of Cape Cod. His drowning and the boat's destruction mirrored so many Indians' fate in the process of English colonization. Regarding Melville's philosophical association between Captain Ahab and the cult of demonic reason and tracing the imprints of Ahab's monomania for vengeance, we need to look at mythological, theological, and scientific foundations of sea-journeying ethos. Western literature is inbred with a plethora of accounts on the nautical journeys from the earliest antique songs of immortality, when the first generation of sea-journeying heroes came out in combat with gods, monsters, and unfriendly kingdoms, to the biblical epitomes of sublimity, where a band of prophets were tested with aquatic rats, recurring as the prototypes of a timeless prophecy in the apostolic age of Christianity, epitomizing the act of going on board a ship and setting sail for fulfilling a unique mission. Whether as a subject of an aquatic drama or a sea journey, this archetypal lineage of ancient heroes and biblical patriarchs inspired generations of circumnavigating voyagers, explorers, and conquerors at their own scheme of devotion to immortality. Scientific thought as well, from its birth in ancient natural philosophy to its evolution into early modern sciences, developed in a cognizance of a corresponding cosmology that undifferentiated the visible from the invisible. From Copernicus to Newton, this urge for an underlying sense of eternity stamped the scientific discourse. When the astronomical measurements of Copernicus helped the advance of geographical explorations and cartography, mapping of an integrated vision of celestial and mondial realms heightened the imperial hubris in the West. Likewise, 19th century rationalism brought forth an epistemological distinction between understanding and reason. Bridging between the universal and the particular, Romantics sought for an underlying set of governing criteria of ethics regarding the correspondence between sense experience and intuitive reasoning. To Emerson, this urge for noumenal knowledge regarded, quote, every natural fact as a symbol of some spiritual fact, unquote. Contrary to Emerson, Melville defied this self-deluding perception of the Romantics as he calls Ishmael to his senses during his masthead watches, awakening Ishmael from his dreamy vision of the immense ocean to the Descartesian corporeality of immediate death. Melville assigns no spiritual alignments to the whaling. Thus, questionings of the shipwreck narrative voice of Ishmael recur through his reversal of binaries constructed on the whiteness of the whale and his following phenomenological evaluations of the sperm whale. Here is an example of the stark difference between the narrative voices of Neoplatonist Ishmael and shipwreck Ishmael. This is when Ishmael recognizes a whale hunter. When a whale hunter called Buffington among the crew of the Pequot. Ishmael is indeed surprised to see him as he had just landed from another whaling ship right before he got on board the Pequot. Quote, but as in the landlessness alone resides the highest truth, shoreless, indefinite as God, so better is to perish in that holding infinite than be ingloriously dashed upon the lead, even if that were safety. For worm-like than oh, who would crave and crawl to land, terrors of the terrible, is all this agony so vain, unquote. In contrast to the metaphysical associations of landlessness of Neoptolemus Ishmael, the point of view of the shipwreck Ishmael, that is Melville, finds no binding element between the highest truth and a shoreless urge for a vengeance except on the part of this attempt. Rather than the highest truth, Melville is engaged in the psyche of craving for immortality. In this regard, Ahab's shoreless madness alludes to the literary legacy of demonic reason. From the ancient songs to biblical literature, human reasoning and progress have been identified with the desire for immortality, most notably depicted with the Faustian figure controlling and conducting the forces of nature, appeared as an archetypal trait of ancient heroes. Here is Hercules and his Nemean lion. And for the alliance of reason and immortality, here is Giambattista Vico's 1744 frontispiece to the new science, which he defined as a rational civil theology of divine providence. And here he introduced the figure of Leo on the zodiac belt encircling the globe as a reminiscence of Hercules' Nemean lion. He says, quote, the figure of Leo means that the principles of my new sign begin by contemplating Hercules, who is the archetype of the founder celebrated by every pagan nation of antiquity. As he performs his greatest labor, the slaying of the Nemean lion, which represents the great ancient forest of the earth, burned off and placed under cultivation by Hercules, thus Leo marks the starting of human chronology, unquote. While Vico spared the ethos of reason from its demonized implications in Western literature, he highlighted its lineage to its ancient sense of immortality with its potential to rise civilizations. With Ahab's madness as an epitome of demonic reason, I refer to his restless urge and craving for immortality. A story as old as the fall, his madness is therefore shoreless, not just because chasing a peculiar whale is restless, but also because he demanded compensation for his loss from an indifferent infinity. Unbound by the mortal sanity, Ahab had to call for all his demons as his madness is maddened. Quote, what I have dared, I have willed, and what I have willed, I will do. They think me mad, Starbuck does, but I am demoniac. I am madness maddened. That wild madness that's only calm to comprehend itself. The prophecy was that I should be dismembered, and I lost this leg. I now prophesy that I will dismember my dismemberer, unquote. In the Castaway chapter following his journey to the beyond realm of the sea, Pip testifies the heaven's sense. Thus, having faced the death which meant the drowning of the infinite of their soul, both Ahab and Pip were reborn on the verge of immortality and felt uncompromised, indifferent as their gods. Ahab's first fatal encounter with Moby Dick costs him his loss of faith. Nevertheless, his vengeful soul becomes an expression of his restless desire for reunion. His demand for a compensation by dismembering his dismemberer sounds fair. On the other hand, his desire for beating a monster at the charge of an uncompromising, indifferent god reveals his urge for immortality and makes him a tragic hero. Here is the 3rd century BC epic poem, the Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodes. The poet calls for Phoebus, the god of fine art and truth, whom will be inspiring the poet himself for recounting the, quote, recounting the famous deeds of men of old, unquote. Within these initial lines, we are given the fact that this poem is told in remembrance of earlier songs of antiquity, most notoriously by Homer. Thus, the reader is reminded of this connected heritage. If we look closer to this illustration, I'm not sure if you can see the whole screen. I think you can see some part of it. And this illustration is also accepted one of the unrecorded image of Jason. He is descending into a dragon and returning with the help of Athena. It evidences that the earliest image of the first sea journey in Greek hero was marked with immortality. The serpent figure reminds us Ouroboros, the ancient Egyptian and Greek symbol of magic and alchemy, which represented the eternal cycle of life, death and rebirth. Returning to the figure of Jason, his heroic deeds display an inbred archetypal expression of immortality, identified with rebirth, eternity, and holistic existence, which assigned his being with a peculiar sense that he was chosen for a mission and gifted by gods. We have the gathering of Argonauts, for example. Here we have the fathers of the future generation, Greek heroes. Here another illustration of Jason carrying away the golden fleece with Medea, and the recurring serpent figure evokes Ouroboros, most probably symbolizing Medea's engagement with magic. Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, ground this earlier archetypal lineage of the sea-journeying heroes in connection with the new generation heroes. In Book 19 of the Iliad, Achilles' mother, Thetis, brings the armor Hephaestus have made for him. When we follow the imagery Homer offers describing the moment of Thetis' fall from Mount Olympus, it is when, quote, the dawn rises up in her golden robe from the ocean tides, unquote, appearing as a binding deity between the divine celestial and mortal realms. With the coming of dawn, the earthly living is touched by the immortal sense. This correspondence between the celestial and aquatic realms inspired Herman Melville too. While describing the ponderous and profound spirit of his white whale, Melville refers to the mist of the whale's spout as a conceit of the mighty. Quote, and how nobly it raises our conceit of the mighty, misty monster, to behold him solemnly sailing through a calm tropical sea, his vast mile head overhung by a canopy of vapor, engendered by his incommunicable contemplations, and that as if heaven itself had put its seal upon his thoughts. For do you see rainbows do not visit the clear air, they only irradiate vapor. And so through all the thick mist of the dim doubts in my mind, and divine intuitions now, and then shut, and kindling my folk with a heavenly rain, unquote. In Greek mythology, the goddess of Eos is personified as the dawn, rising each morning from the edge of the river Okeanos. Most notable story related to Eos or dawn is her love affair with her Trojan prince Tithonus, whom she gifted with immortality but not eternal youth, letting him age without dying. The story of dawn and her lover Tithonus gives us another idea of the predominance of immortality, which can be related to the relationship between nature and human beings. The weakness and vulnerability of human beings confronting the chaotic and undefeatable forces of nature resemble how Tithonus was gifted with both eternity and condemned with the loss of youth. Melville's Ahab was gifted with an unmatched self-aggrandized ego, confronting a monstrous sparmacity in Captain Peleg's verse, which caused him impotency caused by his physical wound and a psychological one also that brought his death. Thus, in the episode The Iliad, Achilles' immortal gift from Hephaestus is given as a consolation by gods for the loss of his beloved friend Patroclus in the hands of Hector. From this moment on, Achilles turns to a murderous machine, much more than he had ever been when fighting the Trojans. Hephaestus' armor legitimizes Achilles' revenge-oriented rage, and in turn he replies to his mother, quote, now by heaven I will arm and go to war, unquote. This will to power displayed by Achilles can be related to Ahab's self-righteous monomaniac rage against the white whale, calling his own madness as madness maddens. Here is Odysseus blinding Polyphemus, for example. This is from Aeneas, shipwreck Aeneas, groaning, saying, oh, 3-4 times fortunate were those who chanced to die in front of their father's eyes under Troy's high walls. So he would rather perish in Trojan war than as a shipwreck. Alongside with the ancient songs of sea journeys, biblical literature offers a recurring series of aquatic wrecks underlying the correspondence between sea journeying and immortality. American Renaissance painter Edward Hicks' 1846 painting of Noah's Ark is a typical illustration of how America gratified her territorial dominance. From the founding colonial rhetoric on, the notion of American Adam persisted in the post-revolutionary 19th century. He gathered both Noah's Ark and the book of Isaiah, prophesying a future nation where wild and tame animals will live together. And this new Zion will lead will lead other nations as peacekeepers. The year of the painting refers to the era of antebellum, when massive changes like civil war and course of westward expansion were awaiting the future generation Americans. In another 1826 painting called Peaceful Kingdom, Hick illustrated the book of Isaiah's prophecy. On the front and right side of the painting, you see wild and tame animals side by side and hybridized, while on the far background and left side, William Penn and natives are illustrated, making peace as Penn offers them gifts in exchange of lands. Here is an illustration of Book of Jonah. We have Christ on the Sea of Galilee. We have Rembrandt's Matthew. Most of you will remember from the first chapters of the novel, when Ishmael meets the Euroclydon at the corner of this Potter's Inn. Moving on to artistic responses for the geographical explorations and scientific inventions in the West, as the first complete modern example, Abraham Ortelius's 16th century map, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, laid down all the unknown corners of the world. Unlike its earliest 6th century BC forerunner, Babylonian Imago Mundi, with its far-reaching obscure lands and mysterious entirety encircled by the bitter river of Oceanus, and we can understand why Ortelius had named his map as Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, inviting the next generation heroes of imperial enterprises in connection with the earlier heroes searching for immortality. Here we have 16th century Flemish artist Johannes Stradonos's illustration. He designed a series of 20 engravings titled Nova Reparta, becoming the first person to depict in print major recent inventions and updates to ancient ones. Regarding the alliance of imperialism and science, Francis Bacon's frontispiece for his 1620 book Novum Organum depicts images of two sailing ships. The one in front is passing through the Pillars of Hercules, marking the end of the known world at the Strait of Gibraltar, while the other one is already on the course towards the undiscovered New World. His subtitle, Great Instauration, announces Bacon's glorifying tone for his future projections of England's naval power, followed by the 1588 defeat of Spanish Armada. The handover of naval and colonial power from her European counterparts to Britain is thus evidenced by the first successful attempts to settle in Northeastern America and the West Indies at the turn of the 17th century. The imagery of the vast ocean and ships in Bacon's book cover for his Novum Organum is not only a remembrance of Christopher Columbus's vessel drawing in his 1493 letter to King Ferdinand, describing the newly discovered New World, but also a replica of André Garcia de Céspedes' 1606 book called Regimen of Navigation. As Bacon's reproduction of these two initial representations of Renaissance spirit, identified with scientific revolutions and discoveries, manifests his reign as the founder of modern science. As an allegory of the new sciences to be obtained by the voyages of exploration, Bacon's Great Instauration was a testimony for legitimizing the colonial utopias of contesting empires of his age. Conclusion. Not surprisingly, most renowned political treatises, compacts, or manifestos were declared on board ships across transoceanic voyages. Pilgrims of William Bradford signed the founding document of American democracy, Mayflower Compact, on board, and the congregation of John Winthrop was ready to hear about his city upon a hill, sound and upright, on the deck of the ship Arabella. Thus, Herman Melville's choice of setting as a whaling ship has direct associations with the political conditions of antebellum America. And with his mythological, theological, and philosophical connotations, he created a timeless, tragic hero for an American epic. In awareness of the anxieties and fears of our age, which have been the legacy of the dangling forces of the preceding century, for us, the 21st century readers, Herman Melville has still so much to say about how to be cautious of the potentiality of long-forgotten horrors of history. Despite our age of global culture and transnational turns in the fields of humanities, we witness massive threats posed by the rising walls of nation-states racing for military power over unequal share of natural resources. The sharpening edge of poverty, inequality, refugee crisis have been among the overwhelming urgencies posed by the constant warfare and political turmoil in the last 30 years. While the multitude suffer the enduring outcomes of power struggles, the racing world powers prevail unconsumed with an ever-ending will to dominate our future. As we live through the reminiscence of the same regressive forces of the preceding centuries, study of literature in lineage with interdisciplinary social sciences has gained great prominence. Well, lastly, sorry. I would like to show you a quotation from a book from Max Scheler. This book is called Resentment. This is a combination of two words, I guess, on talking about the phenomenology of resentment. In his book, Max Scheler says that we believe that the Christian values can very easily be perverted into resentment values and have often been thus conceived. But the core of Christian ethics has not grown on the soil of resentment. On the other hand, we believe that the core of bourgeoisie morality, which gradually replaced Christian morality ever since 13th century and culminated in the French Revolution, is rooted in resentment. In the modern social movement, resentment has become an important determinant and has increasingly modified established morality. And this is all. Thank you for listening.
A couple of weeks ago, my students will remember when I was going through Conrad's Out of Darkness for one of my classes to teach, I came to recognize how much Ahab and Kurds have in common as almost kindred spirits in terms of the ambiguity. And I cannot be the only person who recognizes this. I'm sure it is nothing new for Melville scholars, but it was interesting to me. And it is in this respect maybe very promising to read Moby Dick, I thought, as a text of eco-colonial sublime in the context of nautical Gothic that marks Ahab's tale of liminality, madness, and fall. And Moby Dick, not unlike Conrad's Out of Darkness, is a tale of masculine violence performed with pride and even hubris. I think what modern readers still find fascinating about Moby Dick is Ahab's and his crew's, and most importantly, Ishmael's curiosity about the object of the vengeful hunt or economic exploitation. Ahab's hateful passion for the white whale is furnished by a submerged sense of rivalry and a silent interest towards his fatal enemy. The novel in this respect is unique, I think, among narratives of Western exploitation of foreign territories, including oceans and forests. We as readers not only read detailed information about whales, whaling industry, or the nautical labor involved in turning nature into culture, but are also given personal observation and even empathetic understanding of whales as admirable creatures of the sea. Like the partially visible body of the white whale on the sea surface, the true concerns of Melville's symbolic universe are partially obscured by the human action that drives the storytelling machinery of the book. So the generic marker of the Gothic, independent of its subcategories, which are many, many, of course, is mystery and the conflicting presence of evil or villainy. In landbound or landlocked Gothic of the 19th century, mystery is closely attached to architectural structures in which the tension resides in the opposition between the inside and outside. That is why the early Gothic tales abound in moments of terror and horror that involve threshold elements like windows or doors. Just remember your readings of tappings on window panes, creaking doors, uncanny encounters in corridors or passageways that connect defined isolated spaces or rooms, all of which function as symbolic borders that separate the inside from the outside, the known from the unknown, the familiar from the unfamiliar, the seen from the unseen, etc., etc., all of which, of course, in the Gothic context. Yet it is obvious that we need to move beyond looking for cliché devices of the Gothic, which Robert P. Hume calls Gothic trappings, such as haunted castles, dark dungeons, mad monks, secret chambers, haunting footsteps echoing in dark corridors at night, skeletons, time-yellowed manuscripts, supernatural occurrences, etc., and so on and so forth. So that the quote was from Hume himself. The lens of nautical Gothic allows us to look beyond such accustomed motifs of landlocked Gothic. The terrible beauty of the volatile seascapes alters established parameters of Gothic landscapes, where the sense of the eerie and the uncanny is created larger through architectural symbolism and psychic terrors and torments associated with claustrophobic atmosphere. The Gothic effect created by the vastness of oceanic or nautical space seems to operate through similar channels that govern the narrative structures of landlocked Gothic, especially in terms of the emphasis on the troubling sense of the unknown. In aquatic Gothic, especially those that involve sea creatures either as threatening forces or sources of wonder, the invisible, invincible, inaccessible, and unconquerable depths of the ocean is imagined as a kind of vertical infinity as opposed to the horizontal infinitude of the sea surface. It is on such a Gothic, aquatic, or nautical surface that Ahab chases his demons in Melville's masterpiece. In Moby Dick, the dichotomic trope of inside-outside, one of the founding registers of landlocked Gothic, as I mentioned, is transformed into the conflicting images of depth and surface. In nautical Gothic, the ship floating in the midst of the seascape corresponds to closed spaces of Gothic architecture. Piquet of Moby Dick in its representative image of a floating factory, a capitalist floating factory, is metonymically linked to the capitalist horrors of anthropocentric whaling industry. Yet, ironically enough, it is named after a quote from the novel, a celebrated tribe of Massachusetts Indians, now extinct as the ancient Medes, unquote. It is an old and pre-industrial ship with almost ancient history, as it seems. It is, quote from the novel, of the old school, in Ishmael's words, her ancient decks are worn and wrinkled. It is also an uncanny assemblage of organic and inorganic material. It's a monstrous body. The ship's body is a monstrous one. Its body bears prosthetic parts or additions, such as the tiller, which was, quote, carved from the long, narrow lower jaw of her hereditary foe, unquote. In its hybrid, almost monstrous structural texture, it bears some kind of kinship with its crowned king, the dark Ahab, who partly stands upon an ivory leg fashioned from the polished bone of the sperm whale's jaw. It is remarkable how Ahab becomes an extension of the ship, or how the ship becomes an extension of Ahab's body when he inserts his ivory leg inside an auger hole on the deck. As he steadies his bone leg in that hole, he stands erect, quote, and looking straight out beyond the ship's ever-pitching prow, fixed and fearless, forward dedication of the glance, a troubled master eye, unquote. In one of his moments of outrage, Ahab even compares his body to a ship when he says, "It was Moby Dick that dismasted me." The phallic symbolism of the mast and his prosthetic ivory leg overtly, of course, resonates with Freudian overtones, blending in the dichotomic identifications of the ship as a masculine cultural setting and the seascape as a feminine natural space. As Piquet, the phantom ship, marches on its oceanic path, Ahab roams the ship at night with his ivory leg, making echoes along the deck, quote, every stroke of his dead limb sounding like a coffin tap, unquote, as if walking on life and death, tap, tap, tap on the deck. And tapping sound of Ahab's dead limb on the deck, on the haunted deck, matches the ill-omened atmosphere of Pequod that stands for the only confined space on the oceanic vastness, designed, engineered, and built to enable man to access and survive seascapes. Ships navigate their routed way through a flowing, volatile, and disorderly surface, the sea surface. And Gustav von Krompot, in an early article entitled Moby Dick, The Transformation of the Faustian Ethos, places emphasis on the literal and metaphorical landlessness of a prevailing tendency in the novel. This emphasis on landlessness is important because in our imagination, in our human imagination, the solidness of land is something on which we leave marks of our physical existence on Earth. So solidness of land is important to us as humans, especially graveyards in this sense, for example, provide us with spaces of memory archives in and through which we can trace back personal and communal history. In Moby Dick, Ishmael describes the sea as a space where whalers, quote, have placelessly perished without a grave, unquote. The emphasis placed on sea's landlessness is pretty Gothic in this sense. The sea in its landlessness is contrasted to the land, which is associated with, in Ishmael's words, safety, comfort, hearthstone, supper, warm blankets, friends, all that's kind to our mortalities, unquote. In Ishmael's words again, in landlessness alone resides the highest truth, shoreless, indefinite as God. A perceived infinitude of open water, defined as shoreless by Ishmael, points at the symbolic absence of borders or thresholds, which would mark its spatial identity, sea's spatial identity as a distinct category. This particular aspect of the seascape of Moby Dick invites Hester Blum's observations on eco-Gothic into the discussion. She notes that oceanic space is more than, quote, an organizing metaphor with which to widen a landlocked perspective, unquote. In Emily Alder's words, nautical space, quote, challenges reifying perspectives and embraces what is unspeakable or transgressive. Pequod, like a phantom ship, sails through this unshored, harborless immensities with bottomless deeps. And the sea surface that mimics a promising path for the wandering Pequod is, according to Ishmael, an impenetrable veil covering Ahab's knowledge of Moby Dick. Beneath the wailing surface of unfathomable waters and of lawless seas dwells Moby Dick, quote, one grand-hooded phantom like a snow hill in the air, like Thomas Mann's hill in Magic Mountain, maybe, or the great, like a great Leviathan, the demigorgon, the murderous monster, the demon phantom. So the haunting image of Moby Dick that occasionally and partially pierces through the wailing surface of the bottomless seascape is frequently compared to a gliding and elusive ghost in its almost supernatural whiteness. Supernaturalism of this hue, of this color, in Ishmael's words, gives Moby Dick one visible quality in the aspect of the dead. Ishmael compares Ahab's insufferable foe to phantoms that rise, quote, in a milk-white fog. In moments when Moby Dick and other sperm whales, of course, rise above the wailing surface from the depths of the ocean, the surface becomes a truly Gothic threshold that connects the inside and outside of the novel's nautical space on a vertical axis. That is, it connects the above and below of the sea surface, reflecting how the surface functions as a threshold between these two psychic and even ontological layers. Moby Dick makes itself visible only partially each time it springs out of the water. Ishmael keeps mentioning Moby Dick's, quote, semi-visible body as both ponderous and profound, noting that it is never found on sounding or near shores. No matter how Ishmael tries hard to describe Moby Dick as a holistic image in its entirety, he fails again and again to express the features of his body fully. Its form as a whole is impossible to describe. The surface as an idiosyncratic, transgressive space of threshold connects Moby Dick's body to both above and below the whale. semi-visibility of Moby Dick is thus one of the most significant aspects of its Gothic elusiveness and liminality in the oceanic vastness. Yet, to me, the most remarkable aspect of Moby Dick as a Gothic image is what its body represents in the context of the terrors of the whaling industry. Ishmael observes that the body of a sperm whale is an quote, undecipherable unquote text that bears quote marks engraved upon the body itself like hieroglyphical signs or mysterious ciphers. The mystic marked whale remains undecipherable, according to Ishmael. Ishmael speculates that some of the scratches on the surface of the whale's body may even be made by hostile contact with other whales as well. Beyond such undecipherable marks inscribed on gigantic palimpsestic bodies of whales, Ishmael also relates his encounters with astonishing traces of industrial violence on and in the bodies of whales. As he was cutting into one of the whales with a spade, for example, Ishmael saw that, quote, entire length of a corroded harpoon had been embedded in his flesh, in the flesh of the whale. He was not astonished to see such hybridization, that is the monstrous combination of the harpoon and the whale's body, which recalls Ahab's, of course, hybrid body, because a long quote from the novel, because the stumps of harpoons are frequently found in the dead bodies of captured whales, with the flesh perfectly healed around them and no prominence of any kind to denote their place. But still more curious was the fact of a lance head of stone being found in the whale, not far from the buried iron, the flesh perfectly firm about it. Who had darted that stone lance, and when? It might have been darted by some Northwest Indian long before America was discovered, speculates Ishmael. It has already been 15 minutes, I guess. Let me wrap it up. And of course, these scars and those very scars made by both men hunting whalers and by other whales in hostile contacts under the sea, in the depths of the sea. It brings hunting, the act of hunting, in par with authorship, in a sense. So it, of course, reminds us of Derrida's description of writing as a kind of violence. So the inscribed letters on printed page is perceived by Derrida, is interpreted by Derrida as a kind of violence. Writing is a kind of violence, according to Derrida. And those marks and the palimpsestic nature of Moby Dick's body. So over and over again, one hunter comes and leaves a mark, and another hunter comes again and leaves another mark. It becomes a palimpsest on which author hunters or author whalers leave their violent marks. And as a conclusion, nautical Gothic in Moby Dick, in its overall signification, cannot be isolated from its material context of nautical exploitation of Western industrialism. At the end of the day, as Ishmael concludes, Moby Dick, quote, must die the death and be murdered in order to light the gay bridals and other merrymakings of men, and also to illuminate the solemn churches that preach unconditional inoffensiveness by all to all, unquote. And Ahab, like Conrad's Kurtz, is devoured by his obsession and his darkness within, in stark contrast with the light provided by whale oil. So until technological advancements that enabled men to command oceanic spaces, land was a truly anthropocentric space when compared to seascapes that were beyond anthropocentric dominance and command. Whaling industry and Ahab's chase of Moby Dick may be read as an attempt to turn a non-anthropocentric space into an anthropocentric one, and the nautical space of Moby Dick, after all, is perceived and described from the anthropocentric perspective of Ishmael, the narrator in the nautical Gothic context of the novel. And that will be all. Thank you very much for.
Thank you very much for presenting. So when you write in Google, woman and Moby Dick, this is the only and the first, picture comes there with a woman's t-shirt, which writes just Moby Dick on it. So, And there are two more books. One of them is Melville and Woman. It's a kind of an edited book. It's a kind of a mixture of essays about eco-critical essays or legal essays in poetry and prose, just a kind of a new book about those. And the second book is that Captain Ahab Had a Wife. It's about the New England woman and the whale fishery in 18th and late 19th century. So these are the only one of the few works that can be found theoretically concerning woman and Moby Dick. So today I'm going to talk about a novel, Sanayet Nasnun's 1999 novel, which is called Ahab's Wife or The Stargazer, who narrates the life of a fictional 19th century woman in America named Una, who is Captain Ahab's wife and more. Ahab's Wife resembles Moby Dick in terms of its style and narration. The novel's narrative is not chronological and is as long as Moby Dick with 653 pages. It has been divided into short episodic chapters where the titles of the chapters are similar or identical to Moby Dick. Nasnun's novel as a rewriting of Moby Dick doesn't contradict the storyline of events. It rather serves as a justification of what happened in Pequot. However, unlike these purposeless similarities and borrowings from Melville's novel, it rewrites Moby Dick from a female perspective and goes beyond the great sea epic by introducing a female heroine this time. There can be various explanations for that. First, the novel rewrites the story of the non-existent characters of Moby Dick, who are women, to challenge their limited role in the society of 19th century America. Secondly, it wants to emphasize that literally women can be heroes of sea novels as well, by creating a fictional female character as strong as Ahab with some similarities to him. Thirdly, the novel wants to reiterate women's point of view on different subjects as opposed to men's. Lastly, the novel consciously highlights how a woman's narrative can be different from a man's, in this case, Melville's. The non-existent characters of the novel are women who are the wives of the seamen, like Captain Ahab. Ahab having a wife waiting for him at home is the untold story that was mentioned only twice in Moby Dick in chapters The Ship and The Symphony. In The Ship, Captain Peleg, while introducing Ahab to Ishmael, mentions his wife, quote, "He has a wife, not 3 voyages with it. A sweet, resigned girl. Think of that. By that sweet girl, that old man had a child. Hold you then, there can be utter, hopeless harm in Ahab," end quote. And later in chapter 132, just before the chase begins, Ahab mentions his home, wife, and child in regret for a life spent after the whale. When I think of all this, only half suspected, not so keenly known to me before, and how 40 years I have fed upon dry salted fare, fit emblem of the dry nourishment of my soul, when the poorest landman has had fresh fruit to his daily hand, and broken the world's fresh bread to my moldy crusts away, while oceans away from that young girl wife I wedded past 50, and sailed for Cape Horn the next day, leaving but one dent in my marriage pillow. Wife? Wife, rather a widow with her husband alive. I widowed that poor girl when I married her. Starbuck, and then the madness, the frenzy, the boiling blood, and the smoking brow from which for 1,000 love rings old Ahab had furiously foamingly chased his prey. More a daemon than a man. I see my wife and child in thy eye. Nasnun wants to fill in the gaps between those two short remarks about Ahab's wife. He not only gives life to the wife of the captain, but also creates a lengthy book about her life story. The non-existence of women in the novel can be explained by 19th century literary traditions. The literary area was dominated by men. Though there were efforts of women writers to exist by creating a language of their own, it was mostly a men's domain. As Elaine Showalter states in her book, quote, "In its earlier years, feminist criticism concentrated on exposing the misogyny of literary practice, the stereotypical images of women literature, angels or monsters, the literal abuse or textual harassment of women in classical and popular male literature. Melville's works were no exception to this. His works were like Pequot is a ship with no woman on board. There are some theoretical works which studied this absence in the works of Melville. It has been quoted in Julia Dietersman's article that in 1978, a study on the novel by Henning Cohen and James Cahalan entitled A Concordance to Melville's Moby Dick, the words men and woman are counted. Words man and he appears thousands of times, where woman and wife only appears 35 times, and where it appears they are either wives or widows. In Moby Dick, women do not take an active role in the lives of men, in the whaling ship and in the story. Men exist side by side with other men as companions who seem not to need women for support. They have each other like couples sharing a life and a fate, The woman stayed at home waiting for the sailors. Dieterman says, quote, Melville ascribes a domestic role to the dependent widows and substitutes women for men, whales and nature, all of them turning into symbols of femininity, end quote. Robin Wiegman, in the article entitled Melville's Geography of Gender, offers another explanation. Quote, the male bond provides an illusion of autonomy, of self-creation, end quote. Therefore, men would survive by themselves as able men. Liquid lists several scholars who studied the existence and portrayal of women in a number of Melville's works. They are not particularly about Moby Dick, but provide an understanding of his general approach to women. She calls that Melville portrays women in two ways, quote, either as unwitting sirens whose soft allurements led men to destruction, or as shrews, brutal and uncompromising in their attitudes toward men, unquote. So the novel is a challenge to the role of woman and the choices available to men in the 19th century. It depicts that women have a life other than waiting for their husband's return on the widow's walk. Novel begins with an extract from Margaret Fuller's book, Women in the 19th Century. Her famous quote, let them be sea captains if they will, summarizes the novel's transgression of cult of true womanhood as well. Una literally the one, whose name was inspired from the Fairy Queen, is such a woman against 19th century codes of womanhood, who's neither pure, nor pious, nor domestic, nor submissive. As a reaction to the non-existence of woman, Nastland aims to present a woman this time as a heroine of a sea novel resembling Moby Dick. For this aim, she creates Una with comparable characteristics like Ahab's. In an interview about her character, she answers that she needs to create an equally compelling female counterpart to the male protagonist. She says, quote, I asked myself what kind of woman Ahab would love, and the answer was one who was his equal, so I set out to create her, end quote. Una and Ahab resemble each other with their courageous, challenging, independent personalities, being free spirits, their anti-religious stand, and their thoughts about human nature. The novel reflects women's point of view on various matters, including depictions of Captain Ahab and concepts like sea and sailing. It fills in the missing parts of Melville's narration, like what kind of a husband Ahab was. Ahab's wife begins with Una's words about him, saying that, quote, Ahab was neither my first husband nor my last, end quote. In her novel, the great American hero is depicted as a side character, which Una had married in her life of adventures. The human side of Ahab was mentioned in certain chapters in Moby Dick. He's a grand, ungodly, godlike man. Ahab's above the common. Ahab's been in colleges as well as among the cannibals, been used to deeper wonders than the waves, fixed his fear relents in mightier, stranger foes than whales. Ahab was a crowned king, end quote. Godlike Ahab is depicted as a husband, the father in Moby Dick, only twice in a few lines, quote, hold you then, there can be any utter hopeless harm in Ahab. Ahab has his humanities, end quote. In the symphony chapter also, Ahab is portrayed not only as a monomaniac man full of rage, but a sufferer of fate, longing for his wife and son. It's a dialogue between Starbuck and Ahab where the former tried to persuade the captain to give up the chase and return to his homeland. Thinking of his home, he says, I have seen them some summer days in the morning, about this time, yes. It is his noon nap now. The boy vivaciously wakes, sits up in bed, and his mother tells him of me, of cannibal old me. How I am abroad upon the deep, but will yet come back to dance with him again. Nastland's novel narrates the story of an old man falling in love with a young, intellectual, and courageous woman. Ahab is a passionate husband, a lover, a father, and moreover, a father-like figure for Una. Una chooses him as a husband because of his credibility, strength, and similarity with herself. As a woman and a wife, she experienced part of his character, which nobody ever saw before. Therefore, he is far more different than his position as an obsessive and angry captain. Una falls in love with both his affectionate and strong side. I didn't want him to rage again, quote. I wanted him to bring peace. If there was any trust in my life, it was in him, end quote. Being a humanitarian and a transcendentalist, she sometimes doubted about Ahab's decision of chasing the whale for revenge. She asks herself why Ahab cannot forgive the whale. She and her child has a conversation about him, chasing the whale madly with great ardor. My father sees the whale because he loves him. That is not true, mother. He hates the whale. How is it then he pursues Moby Dick with so great love? Your father loves not the whale, but he loves the idea of revenge. This is part of himself that he loves now. That part would punish the whale for taking his leg. Moby Dick is a thief. Aye, and he has stolen away more than the father's leg from us. Couldn't he not forgive the whale? He burns his heart for revenge, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But Moby Dick has no leg, he says. Written from a woman's point of view, the novel criticizes mankind's passions of revenge, hatred, and obsession, and offers another perspective. C is another motive in the novel, which demonstrates woman's point of view. It represents freedom and independence, and also the forbidden area of a man's sphere, which Una get into disguise. In the novel, the island and the lighthouse is a metaphor for woman's world and domesticity, where sea is a world of wisdom, and sea journeys are not only the discovery of the world, but the discovery of oneself. In Ahab's Wife, the dichotomy between land and sea is predominantly throughout the novel. For Ahab, land and home are concepts that he cannot identify with. He mistrusts land, which he says is like words giving a different meaning to everyone. The sea is more secure and trusted as it's changeable and non-promising. Sea, quote, bears all her changeability on her face and so is more kind, end quote. For Una, the sea is cruel, but land and home represent a settled life. She argues that sea is not limitless as all sea journeys end at the land just like hers. Sea signifies immortality, infinity, and change. Ahab's Wife, although being a woman's narrative, comments on the hardships of whaling from time to time, just like Moby Dick. In times when they are butchering a whale, for example, such scenes of blood and details appear different from Moby Dick. For example, on the whale boat, after butchering the whale, she writes romantic scenes under the moonlight where spermacety covers all of the ship and fills the air like violet's fragrance. In another instance, unlike the descriptions of Pequod as a masculine figure in Moby Dick, she represents a feminine ship where the whale is a he. How feminine we the ship seemed in comparison, how white and swan-like, despite our jagged stop, we had moved before the stream of frost wind. No wind would move his mass. Black and dense, completely powered only by his own will and muscle, he lolled before us. Her narration differs from Melville's, including everything a woman experiences in life, including childbirth, monthly periods, motherhood, daughterhood, love, romance, and domestic issues like sewing and cooking. For instance, sewing, which is regarded as a means of domesticating them, is used in the novel as one of the elements which empowers Una. Una has her own female language to describe the wailing as well. Instead of shouting, "There she blows and spouts," she says, she was not spouting, but sewing the water with her body, headed for the open sea. Another recurring motif of woman's narrative is the relationship of woman and nature in harmony, as opposed to the relationship between man and nature, which leads to death and destruction. The main point in the novel can be summarized as woman's wholeness with the nature leads to survival at the end. Una and Ahab represents two opposite sides belonging to different sexes. In many instances, Ahab is portrayed as furious to nature, but woman is depicted as an inseparable part of nature. For example, in the novel, the time is measured with nature by collecting stones and watching waves. In another instance, time is measured with pregnant aunt's belly or her mother harvests in nature. The whale representing the nature has different connotations for our heroine, as opposed to the male heroes of Moby Dick. She calls the whale as noble woman. She kills no more than any creature of the sea, she says. Her nobility lay in her freedom. Killing a whale is innocent blood for Una. She criticizes the male world of whaling, in which an animal with an heart is induced to oil. The way the harpooner stood there, poised to hurl at the gigantic animal, reminded me of stories of knights and dragons. So unequally matched they seemed. But isn't the fairy tales of monsters and men? The man prevailed in this case, assisted by other men, and conveys to the battle place first by mighty whale ship, and finally by lesser whale boat. But I do not think dragons drained such sad blood, nor were dragons ever female. And this whale evidently was, for I saw her calf, who had been hiding under her, like a dart chick, grow frightened and swim away. One of the most striking parts of the novel is when she encounters Moby Dick. It is when she was placed on the masthead to weave the ocean, but as she hides him and doesn't cry out, it is her respect of the nature, unlike a man's narrative, or unlike the male heroes would do. A wasp? What is that form? It slides under the water, all square in front and tapering. How come that iceberg so rapidly, so close? Not ice, living flesh. A sperm whale the color of ice, he turns and swims parallel to us. He's like a ghostly shimmer under the blue-white water. He could be a mass of bubbles, a cloud. Why should I cry out? He doesn't spout his presence. He's all submerged, peaceful, the warm-blooded part of the blue-white silver of his day. Ahab, you assign me, sign out for icebergs only. I will bless you this voyage with silence on the subject of a white whale and all his massive innocence. So I subverted the trust of my captain. But instead of guilt, I feel an invigorated peacefulness. Ahab's wives rewrites Moby Dick by introducing the non-existent characters of the sea epic, who are women, by introducing the wife of Ahab. Moreover, a woman character not only exists in the novel, but appears as the heroine of the novel with equal strength and courage as him. Thus, the novel challenges the role of women in 19th century America by depicting the heroine who can experience adventures who are available to men at those times, and at the fictional accounts. The introduction of a wife having her own story to tell is also the means by which to show women's point of view on various matters, unlike male narratives. In a letter written to Margaret Fuller about women's literature and life in general, Yuna asks, if one wrote America, Man, a modern epic, quest, it ended in death and destruction, should a tale not have its redemptive features? Was it not possible instead for a whole human life to end in a sense of wholeness, of harmony with the universe? And how might a woman live such a life? The answer is in the novel, which proves that a woman's narrative is different than a man's. It is a story of man versus nature, where nature beats man at the end. However, for a woman's narrative, woman and nature exist in harmony, side by side, no matter how many hardships a woman lives. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
My presentation, I don't think it'll be as academic as the previous presentations were. It's more of a storytelling. So that's why, hence the title, Remember That Time When Deadpool Killed the Whale? Well, the story goes something like this. So I'll be introducing Deadpool and his interaction with the white whale, as you can see from the title slide. All right, so let's see how the story actually goes. All right, so first of all, before I begin, if you're familiar with the character of Deadpool, you might know that he's not a friendly character in terms of, of age-wise. So we need to be careful if anyone is triggered by graphic content or disturbing themes such as torture, violence, assault, blood, death, and dying. I will let you know when I show those slides, right before I show those slides, so you can turn it off, and I'll let you know when that slide has passed. But this is Deadpool. So let's see how the story goes. All right, first of all, Deadpool is one of those characters who loves breaking the fourth wall. So he knows that he's a fiction. He knows the audience is there, either from the comic book or from the movies. You might see him turn directly and look at the screen and actually talk with us. So here's two examples of that. And yeah, he knows that we're here because he can see us. So he does use these techniques, and that kind of takes us into the story with him. So we're not just voyeurs looking on, we are being looked at as well. And I think the main important part of this is he knows he's fictional. So we have a character that is aware of its fictionality. And let's see, we can look at how that plays in the graphic novel of that we'll be looking at today. All right, so the one I'll be looking at today specifically is Deadpool Illustrated. It's the second volume of the Deadpool Kilogy, or Kilology, as some people prefer to call it. It's a 3-volume set. The first one is about how Deadpool kills the Marvel Universe. I won't be going into any detail about that. So if you're interested in it, I will not give you any spoilers. Let's just say for reasons unknown, he just decides to kill the Marvel Universe. But after he does decimate the Marvel Universe, there's something else that kind of bugs him. He knows that it's not enough, that he needs to do something more. So in the second installation of the Kilogy, he decides to kill the ideas that are behind the characters of the Marvel Universe. So by going to the root, by going to the idea where these characters emerge from, if you get rid of the idea, then you get rid of the story. So he's looking at it from a very different perspective. All right, so Deadpool, his job isn't done yet. So now, so in order to kill the ideas that are created, he needs to get to the root of things. So he asks these mad scientists of the Marvel Universe to build him a portal in which he will be able to travel through the Ideaverse. So after killing the Marvel Universe, he realizes that it will never end. So by just killing one universe, a fictional universe, the stories will continue. So in order to kill the stories, you need to kill the ideas behind those stories. And so the ideas that are behind the fictional universes are very, very important. And one of the most major and important metaphors you'll see is Moby Dick. So these are the 4 issues that make up the second volume of the Deadpool trilogy. The first one obviously is Moby Dick. The second one, Tom Sawyer. The third one is A Christmas Carol, and the fourth one is Sherlock Holmes. So not only are these ideas butchered or tried to be eliminated, but within each issue, there are a lot of other characters and storylines that kind of emerge from one image. So looking at these images, then we can say that, well, there are many notable characters that we know. So I'm sure you're very familiar with all of these. So in the first issue, the one that we'll be looking at today, the Moby Dick issue, we have Don Quixote, we have Pinocchio, we have Sherlock Holmes that emerge. In the second issue, in the adventures of Tom Sawyer, we have Dracula, the Headless Horseman, Little Women, Beowulf, Hua Mulan, and many other characters. In the third installation, third issue, we have Scrooge, obviously, from The Christmas Carol, Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Moreau, Gulliver, Mowgli, The Little Mermaid, Captain Nemo, of course, Scylla and Charybdis from Greek mythology. And in the fourth installation, the fourth issue, we have The Witches of Macbeth, Poe's Raven, The Portrait of Dorian Gray, Gregor Samsa, The Three Musketeers. So we do interact, Deadpool does interact with each of these characters. He decimates most of them. So by killing the Raven, by killing Poe's Raven, you can imagine what is lost in literature, or what ideas are lost down the way. All right, so skipping to the next slide then. So if we just focus on how Moby Dick is portrayed, because the first issue is named Moby Dick, we have the setting. This is the first panel on a full page. The first panel shows us the setting. So we're in the Pacific Ocean, it's 1850, and we see Deadpool's shadow, and he's just contemplating, he's waiting in silence for the whale to emerge so he can decimate him. So the first issue, like I said, the name named Moby Dick, it tackles perhaps the most inspirational and most foundational image there is, and that is the inspiration of the whale that was birthed in the 19th century. So hunting the white whale in an almost Ahabian manner is interesting. The first panel, it takes us into the idea world of the white whale. So moving on to the second panel then. This is the central panel. This is when he says, we're going to need a bigger boat. So he's still waiting for everything to happen. So the year is, if I go back to the first one, the year is 1850. So hang on, let me see if I can go back. Okay, yeah, so the year is 1850. I think this is very significant if we remember that the novel was published in 1851. So the events taking place here take place a year before. So this minor detail alludes to the idea that the events of Moby Dick are very much factual, at least in this universe. And the year later, a narrator will start writing, Call Me Ishmael. So if we do get to the central panel then, Deadpool is in deep contemplation with a harpoon in his hand. It is not the Pequod, but rather a very skimpy, tiny little boat that he's in. His stillness kind of contrasts with the waves of wavy motion of the ocean, and with the clouds inherent in the background. So this does form a kind of a contrast together. So the last two panels, the final two panels on the bottom of the page, this is where the waiting has ended. With the sound, we have probably the sound coming from the blowhole of the whale, and this is time for action. So we hear the sound, and then a possible emergence of the whale, and the stillness of Deadpool is now shot. So looking at the page as a whole then, patience is a virtue, or is it? So why was Deadpool waiting for the whale? just to decimate it. By killing the white whale, what is he hoping to accomplish? What other narratives have emerged from Moby Dick, from having Moby Dick? Or if we do eliminate the idea of Moby Dick, what will we be eliminating from literary history? These are questions that come to mind when we look at the reason why he begins with Moby Dick in the first place. So as a page, when we look at the page as a whole, we experience a sense of time, a passage of time in a way, especially with the center image. We know that he's been patiently waiting for a very long time. And finally, his patience does pay, because on the next page, in the next frame, we have the emerging whale depicted. Even in this close-up shot of the whale with the eye looking back at you, so we have hunter and hunted. Who's the hunter? Who's the hunted? It's not really prevalent. It's not really out in open. But even then, you can see the markings or older harpoons stuck on the face of the whale. So this is a very experienced image. This image, this metaphor, whatever it represents, is age-long. People have tried to, or have tried to tear it down, have tried to modify it for their own experiences, used it to fulfill their own ideas, but it stays as a whole. You can scratch at it, you can try to eliminate it, but it's there. In the consecutive 4 panels, you see this is Deadpool's challenge with the whale, to see who will conquer the other. And let's look at the fall. Let's look more deeply at the fall of Deadpool. All right. So if we look at this in a close-up, I love what he says. He says the metaphor isn't lost on me. So yeah. So whatever metaphor the whale stands for, Deadpool is very much aware of what he represents. I just said he for the whale, by the way, he or she. So let's just call it the whale as a genderless being. So by looking at the whale, whatever metaphor the whale represents, it's not lost on Deadpool. All right. So being swallowed by the metaphor in the 3rd and 4th panels, then. This is kind of like a Pinocchio-esque story that we have here. So now he's in the belly of the whale, or it might even hearken to Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, with the journey of the hero being in the belly of the whale, being one of those images. All right, so the next image is bloody and violent. So if you don't want to see the image of blood and the shedding of blood, please, turn away or shut your screen off for a few seconds. All right, here it goes. So obviously, this double page image kind of shows us what the Pequod people are doing, what the sailors, what Ahab and his crew are doing, and how Deadpool is emerging from the blowhole of the whale. So the Pequod, Ahab and his sailors are not really understanding what's going on. All they know is that Ahab was out hunting the whale, hunting his indestructible enemy, shall we say. And that's why he yells out, no, because he wanted to be the one that kills it. But he doesn't really know exactly what's happening at this moment until Deadpool emerges from the blowhole of the whale. So it's very graphic. Literature, in a way, is being rewritten just before it's being destroyed. So with the destruction of the whale, we may lose things, we may regain other things. So now we have 2 parallel stories that's going on, one Ahab's story and the other of Deadpool's story. So just by looking at the imagery that's presented here, we can say that we could consider Deadpool raping the whale, raping the foundational metaphor, or defiling the body, defiling the virginity of the image of the white whale. So it's very symbolic on many, many multiple levels. All right, let me see. Yeah, the next, all right, so you can come back. No more blood for now, at least not on this slide. Just as a close-up to the image then, here we have Ahab. This is one of the panels from the previous slide that I showed you. So you can see exactly what he's saying. So he says, no, he's my kill. He belongs to me. So obviously for Ahab, the whale is masculine. they have to be masculine, because a female would be too weak to be conquered, or at least in these masculine narratives, that's how the female image is generally viewed as. So he said, I swore to chase him to the abyss itself, and it seems the beast would hold me to that promise. He tasks me. So right now it's like a lamentation of losing the whale just when he was about to decimate it. So he's not happy that his ultimate goal, the aim was to kill the whale. The whale is dead. So what's the problem, right? But no, that's not the situation here. It was a quest that leaves Ahab unfulfilled at this point in time. Right, so the next two slides are also bloody. So if you are triggered by such images, you can turn away or shut your screen for a few seconds. All right, here it goes. All right, so in the close-up, he says, even in death, he tasks me. So it's like the whale is taunting him even after it has died. So right now, Ahab is unaware that he has been killed by someone else. The dead carcass right now for him is his unfulfilled wish, just lying there. And the next bloody slide was a close-up of Deadpool coming out of the bloody whale hole. So by slashing and cutting his way out of that, it does give you this imagery of he was swallowed by the whale and then he emerges from the whale. We could also look at this as a rebirth for Deadpool, or another version of Deadpool that's coming on. But anyway, he hacks through bone and sinew, and he does decimate the unbeatable, the unkillable white whale. So, all right, the blood scenes have now ended, so you can come back if you were trigger warned before. So right now we look at now here we have the image of Ahab's words. Someone says a survivor, but the way Ahab is considering it, if we look at Ahab's words, he says he killed the monster, he killed Moby Dick. What is he wearing? Bring him on board. So there's this commotion that's going on. But the way that Moby Dick is seen is obviously as a monster. And if we look at monster theory, if we look at Moby Dick from the lens of monster theory, it represents everything that we repress. It represents unquenchable desires. It represents the thing that we want to attain but can't. So it has. It's the image of the monster kind of oscillates between awe and fear. So when we look at Moby Dick from that lens, yeah, he does represent, or Moby Dick does represent that image that both contains awe and fear, something that we want to attain, but something that we also fear because just of its sheer size, I would say. All right, the next panel is also very telling. Yeah, he encounters a character which obviously it's Pinocchio, and by killing Pinocchio, he's killing other characters in the Marvel, or he's killing the idea for other characters in the Marvel universe. I won't go into that, but listen, if we look on the second half of the slide, you're on the Pequod now, stranger. I'm Captain Ahab, extending you my hospitality. Who might you be? And I love this comment that he makes. He says, call me Ishmael. So it's a character that is aware of his own fictionality, as a character that is aware of fiction itself. By using this line, he's creating a clash between the actual Ishmael that is actually there on board. So when he says, call me Ishmael, again, another violent scene is coming up. Ishmael says, but that's my name. Oh, neat. Let's see what else we have in common. And then he said he just takes out his knife and he kills Ishmael, because if you kill Ishmael, you're killing the narrator. When you kill the narrator, you will not have a story. So remember, the events taking place in this comic book version was 1850. So by killing Ishmael in 1850, even if the Pequod gets back and harbors, gets back to the harbor, there will be no Ishmael to even tell of this story. So that kind of gives us a lot to think about. So I'd like to end my presentation here. Thank you very much for putting up with me and for listening to me. Thanks.
So from Züleyha's marvel, now I would like to take you back to history. Actually, because I would like to start with German idealism in scope of my paper, okay, which is entitled Land versus Sea. First of all, I want to make it clear that I intend to read Moby Dick as a novel deconstructing the binary oppositions of land and sea. For I believe that the significance of the novel is derived from Melville's intention to go against the grain. Although novel seems like portraying human and non-human natures in contrast, I consider Moby Dick as a critique on the idea of binary oppositions prevalent in the 19th century thinking. I argue that it is unity and wholeness rather than the dialectical rhetoric between land and sea, which forms the underlying message of the novel. So how is this binary opposition of land and sea reflected on a theoretical base in the 19th century philosophical and artistic imaginations? Can we read land as an enclosed, familiar and controlled place, whereas sea as the unknown, unrestrained, open space? Here, I want to open a parenthesis to include dark woods and forests as well, to some certain extent, right next to the concept of sea, because in many of the 19th century romantic works and Gothic narratives, take, for instance, the examples produced by Mary Shelley, Poe. There are not numerous works by Poe, Lord Byron, Bram Stoker, the Brontes, H.P. Lovecraft, Coleridge, and many, many others. And in all those examples, we may see a familiar dichotomy between land versus dark woods or forests. So, for instance, I also consider the concept of dark woods in relation with sea here in the scope of my paper. Okay, to start with a theoretical base, I will argue that according to 19th century romantic tradition, especially in dark romanticism, nature versus culture reflects the symbolic opposition between land and sea in a dialectical manner. With this in mind, in terms of German idealism, I will very briefly talk about the Nietzschean forces of the Dionysius and Apollonian, and secondly, Freudian concepts of Thanatos and Eros, and thirdly, a brief mentioning of Schopenhauer's will, derived from Kantian sublime. And on an artistic scale, I will include the willing suspension of disbelief by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and the concept of negative capability by Keats. And all these references will help us to understand the symbolic opposition between land and sea as manifested figuratively in this novel. Okay, to begin with Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, writing in 1872, he actually tackles the Greek gods Apollo and Dionysus as the sources of inspiration central to his theory of tragedy, born out of a tension between two contrasting but harmonious spectrums. And Nietzsche weaved the opposing forces of Apollonian and Dionysian as a powerful tension, one that he believed was essential for creativity, art, and culture to flourish. And these artistic impulses could lead to a higher form of existence, as argued in The Birth of Tragedy in the following quotation. Some fundamental psychological experience, like the word Apollonian, stands for the state of repose in the presence of a visionary world, in the presence of the world of beautiful appearance designed as a deliverance from the beginning. unquote. So that is to say, the Apollonian force stresses form and intellect, and it is linked to order, rationality, and reason. On the other hand, Dionysian represents passion, emotion, irrationality, covering the instinctual and chaotic aspects of nature and of human nature that seek to break free from the constraints of reason and order. So both forces are complementary to one another, and without the Apollonian, the Dionysian mind cannot have a perspective, actually, and vice versa is also possible. And secondly, the Apollonian and Dionysian forces can also be associated with Sigmund Freud's theory of death and life drives, as represented by Eros and Thanatos in his study Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Again, quoting from Greek mythology, Eros is the primordial god responsible for love, desire, fertility, creativity, while Thanatos is the god of death, self-destruction or destruction, annihilation, aggression, and decay. Freud believed that the human psyche was driven by these opposing forces, Eros, which is the life drive, and Thanatos, which is the death drive. And the majority of our actions, according to Freud, are motivated by libidinal drives, which he described with the concept, through the concept of Eros. But since these impulses are insufficient for the self, the death drive, defined via Thanatos, is also necessary for the self. Therefore, Eros and the Apollonian force are comparable in that they both symbolize the life-affirming elements of nature, and correspondingly, Nietzsche's Dionysian force can be similar to Freud's Thanatos, as both represent the irrational, chaotic, destructive aspects of human nature. Okay, and then thirdly, here comes Schopenhauer. So I'm going to mention very briefly on his concept of the world as will, actually, which is highly a very complex and intense matter to be summed up in 15 minutes here. So I will just very briefly talk about it. So in his study, he puts forward another parallel study, influential actually on both Nietzsche and Freud. In that study, he somewhat working in a similar fashion with that of Edmund Burke's and Kant's idea of sublime versus beautiful. He argues that human willing is the center of human suffering. And human drives like force, power, impulse, and energy create the will to live, which at the same time condemns the individual into an endless suffering and inner conflicts. However, without one, the other cannot happen. So mankind always finds himself pessimistically entrapped in an endless play of will, which is motivated at the same time may only be overcome by the lack of it. Okay, so I think we're clear up to this point. So from German idealism, now I would like to continue with the artistic trends of 19th century Romanticism. In that sense, I would like to comment on Coleridge and Keats and his ideas about the willing suspension of disbelief and negative capability. So what are those terms actually? So Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in his essay Biographia Literaria, argues the avoidance of logic in understanding something unreal or fantastic, which motivates and at the same time enhances human capacity for pleasure or artistic pleasure. Likewise, Keats in 1817. Actually, he argues that mind's ability to negate itself at times of confusion, ambiguity, and uncertainty, which creates a positive and a willing sense, which is necessary for human nature. So in that respect, as followers of Kantian idealism, both Coleridge and Keats base their artistic theory on a dichotomy of contrasting forces similar to Apollonian and Dionysian impulses inherent in man. Okay, so now let's continue with the novel. The symbolic dichotomy between nature and culture forms the figurative basement of Western thinking, which positions nature in many of the romantic and dark romantic narratives as a dynamic force, a fascinating monster from sublime to unheimlich. In a flux of change, it is described as a process, a fluid entity, a non-human agency in itself, whereas culture is perceived as a static, regulatory organ, highly authoritative and reasonable entity. This binary opposition is further revealed within the contrast between land and sea in many of the 19th century works, not just in Melville's novel. Land is a notion that refers to a structured, regulated part of civilization where humanity has upheld their own rules and laws to maintain order apart from the land. The sea is perceived to be chaotic and unpredictable part of nature, which has long allowed for the idea of mobility, transgression, and excess. Okay, so in Melville's novel Moby Dick, let's look at the defining adjectives for the sea that indicate a Dionysian feature in that sense, underlying sublime forces. Like, what are those adjectives? Everyone will remember very quickly, like formlessness, endlessness, like masterless, uncivilized nature, the savage nature, the savage sea, awful sea, infinite sea, immeasurable sea, perilous sea, mystic, bottomless, unpredictable, and untamed sea. And this like goes on forever, all throughout those pages. Land, on the other hand, is defined through the Apollonian as a place of conformity, norm, tradition, authority, regulation, and likewise. Now, I'd like to here add a quotation. If I were to show you that quotation, it would be wonderful, but now there's a problem. So I'm sure you will remember it easily. It begins with the sentence, "Consider the subtleness of the sea." Now, let's pay attention to the adjectives that are used to define land versus sea. The subtleness of the sea, how its most dreaded creatures glide underwater, unapparent for the most part, and treacherously hidden beneath the lovely tints of azure. Consider the devilish brilliance of and the beauty of many of most remorseless tribes as the dainty embellished shape of many species of sharks. Consider once more the universal cannibalism of the sea. So if you were in a course right now, I would have asked you to underline the adjectives. My students will easily appreciate that. Consider once more the universal cannibalism of the sea, all whose creatures prey upon each other, carrying on an eternal war since the world began. Consider all this and then turn to the green earth. Consider in the thinkers of the half-long life. God keep thee, push not off from the isle though can never return, unquote. It's taken from chapter 58, I guess. So here, mentioning of Tahiti is of course important, for it stands in general, it stands for land in general. It's like a comfort zone with systematic rules and traditional structures. It may also represent USA in other figurative contexts, you know. Ocean stands for the unknown. Man, it stands for man's thirst for knowledge of the unknown. Despite the dangerous reality of the sea, man must overcome this difficulty in order to start his self-journey, or in other words, one's transformation. The sublime definition of the sea as both fascinating and threatening brings in mind the Keatsian feature of negative capability necessary for man to survive on water. In other words, characters ought to negate their logic and go to extremes at times of uncertainty and chaos. That's the only way to survive. Okay, here comes another quotation right now. Unquote. These are the times of dreamy quietude when beholding the tranquil beauty and brilliance of the ocean skin, one forgets the tiger that pants beneath it. Unquote. So likewise, here, like in the earlier quotations, the willing suspension of Ismail's disbelief is remarkable here in this quotation, as he's eager to dwell in uncertainty of the sea in a very passionate way, as much as Ahab is driven blind through his obsession with sea, and he's able to negate his logic to stand still in uncertainty when he says, actually in another quotation, sea is perceived to be an everlasting terra incognita. One can assume that the transgressive forces are waiting for men to overcome. Yet, through the end, the human challenge against the sea manifests itself more in a pessimistic manner, underlying morbidity and fragility of mankind in the face of nature. In that sense, the infinite urge, this endless urge of man to fill the void in himself is parallel to the Schopenhauerian will to live that which may cause entrapment and self-destruction for the character. Okay, and moreover, the characters in the novel are more concerned with order, logic, control, before they depart for the Odyssey. So before the Odyssey, I mean the journey on Pequea, they're different. After, they're different. In the beginning chapters, they are bound to the rules of the lands where civilization prevailed. For example, in the case of Ishmael, his passivity, his nausea, and his the sense of lack of belonging in city life are juxtaposed with his embracing of Dionysian fate at sea. Here comes a quotation told by Ishmael. Whenever I find myself growing grim above the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November, it's actually in the opening page of the novel, November in my soul, a drizzly November in my soul. Look at the description. Whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffee warehouses, etc., it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately knocking people's heads off. Then I count it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. So this is a substitute for suicide, actually. Going to the sea is a substitute. Here, Ishmael's urge to deliberately knock people's heads off represents a desire to challenge society norms. Although the sea is challenging and isolating for Ishmael, he discovers meaning and harmony on water, something he was not able to find on land before. He catches, in quotations, a mystical vibration on water where In landlessness alone resides the highest truth, unquote. As argued by one of the critics, the fact that Ishmael spends most of his time at sea, not hunting the whales, but actually thinking about them, contemplating about them, transforms the ship Pekua into a kind of Ivy League campus or school that he had loved to learn from, unquote. Ishmael says, we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans, it is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, unquote. In the case of another character entitled Pip, and I will not talk about his fall into the ocean. So after he falls into the ocean, so he has fallen into the ocean for some time, actually for several times, he is somewhat portrayed in a Freudian manner of death wish. He is never the same person as he had been earlier. He metamorphoses almost into that person because the sea has taught him to contemplate on life and on his existence, and this is unbearable for him. Pip has been overwhelmed by sublime forces of the sea, which gradually transforms him into a pessimistic person who has lost his will to live in a Schopenhauerian manner. Now here comes another quotation, which describes Pip actually before and after his fall into the sea. So, unquote, among the joyous, heartless, and ever juvenile eternities, Pip saw the multitudinous, God omniscient coral insects that off the permanent waters have heaved close orbs. He has seen God's foot upon the treadle of the loom and spoke it, and his shipmates called him mad. Absurd and frantic, veil or woe, feels an uncompromised, indifferent as his cause, God, unquote. All right. And what about the late 18th and 19th century industrial spirit? So back at those times, actually, due to the Industrial Revolution and capitalistic and colonial interests, America adopted a concept of a very passive and tamed land that was directly associated with taking, claiming, conquering, since possessing the land underlying authority or order over the land. This is also true for claiming of the whale for capitalistic reasons. However, sea as a fluid frontier. This is the term by Mercy Elliott, by the way. This is a specific term. So the concept of sea as a fluid frontier, unfit for domination, offers transgression and excess, which triggers Dionysian impulses in man. Melville explains this in Moby Dick through the voice of Ishmael when he says, how I snuffed that Tartar air, how I spurned the turnpike earth, that common highway all over Danton with the marks of slavish heels and hooves, and turned me to admire the magnanimity of the sea, which will permit no recourse, unquote. Moreover, Ishmael's Dionysian impulse gives more weight to the primal emotions that are impossible to grasp without first experiencing them, such as his latent homosexuality. The sea, however, offers mobility and limitless possibilities where one might find one's true self. On land, Ishmael is crossed by conflicts, yet freedom exists as a possibility on the sea with no land in sight. Consider Ishmael's feelings for Kikik in the beginning of the novel when they meet at the inn, remarking his cannibalism or homosexuality. You may read it in multiple terms. Ishmael feels annoyed, terrified by the idea of sharing the same room with him. However, after sailing for sea, the two men become best friends, quote, an innate sense of delicacy occurs in between them. And this can be perhaps read as a homoerotic sign rather than friendship, unquote. How it is, I know not, but there is no place like a bed for confidential disclosures between friends. Man and wife, they say, they're open the very bottom of their souls to each other, and some old couples often lie and chat over old times till nearly morning. Thus, then in our heart's honeymoon lie I and Kiki, a cozy, loving pair, unquote. It is also Ahab. Let's turn back to the main character, the villain, or whatever he is. It is also Ahab who feels different on land and water. Ahab, in a self-questioning manner, views his life at the sea as futile, yet somewhat instructive, as the sea has made him know himself through his encounter with the larger forces in life. Now, here comes a long quotation, but I will cut it short. So that's the quotation. That's the dialogue. He's speaking to Starbuck about his life. And he says that it is a mild wind, a mild looking sky on such a day, very much such a sweetness as this. I struck my first veil as a boy 40 years ago. 40 years on the pitiless sea. For 40 years has Ahab forsaken the peaceful land. For 40 years to make war on the horrors of the deep. And he says many other things. And at the end of that quotation, actually, he says that he feels quite sorry for leaving aside his wife, actually. He says, leaving but one dent in my marriage, pillow, wife, rather a widow with her husband alive. So this is actually a very sad quotation. But again, in the sadness of it, we can see how Ahab has realized himself as a true person, as a complete person, by challenging the life at sea. Ahab's leaving his wife at home and going for the sea reminds me of another poor fellow like young Goodman Brown, actually, who will know very well in his journey through the dark woods. Leaving his faith and encountering truth or delirium in darkness. The symbolic dichotomy between land and sea is portrayed via Ahab's leaving his comfort zone, his logical codes in society, and embracing hardship and sometimes irrationality. And this teaches Ahab to position himself both in time and space as a complete person. Thus, for Ahab, the whole universe is more than merely a backdrop. So this is actually an argument that belongs to Moretti, a famous critic. When Ahab claims the lashed sea's landless latitude, we know the sea to be everlasting terra incognita. So more like in a Schopenhauerian manner, Ahab is portrayed in a constant futile self-struggle and challenge against nature, which at the end brings his end. However, it is not the death of Ahab the novel underlines. On the contrary, it is the process one's will to live on the road to excess. Also, okay, so as a last word, I would like to end my speech saying that. So in the scope of this paper, I have read Nature versus Culture dichotomy from the lenses of German idealism, mentioning Nietzsche, Freud, Schopenhauer, and some of the important guys from Romantic literature like Coleridge and Keats, and their very famous literary points. I tried to explore on the 19th century Romantic worldview, which operates as a dividing line between land and sea. However, the novel, I would argue, subverts this symbolic dichotomy on many levels, not only just on a character level, actually, but on many levels. Melville portrays a kinship, in my opinion, a synthesis between human and non-human natures rather than a break. Throughout the novel, he doesn't privilege land over sea or the vice versa. Both are necessary and essential factors for human beings to understand their place in nature. Land and sea, rather than land versus sea, come together in producing meaning. Knowing the whale means knowing oneself, and in order to know oneself and one's place in the universe, mankind needs to understand and appreciate the intertextuality, referentiality among different platforms. Other way, knowledge will be partial and will lie only on the surface. As a result, the interpenetration of land and sea in general natural culture highlights a non-anthropocentric message at the end. It is clear that each character is motivated and defined through their relationships with heterotopia, a more modern term to say here, termed by Foucault, if you like. So in that case, heterotopia in that respect can be perceived as an environment open to countless possibilities in the case of the whale ship, standing liminal in between land and sea. Characters who are able to welcome otherness and diversity will be the ones left to survive. Yet this is not to say that death of the characters imply defeat. Each character endeavor in the midst of unknown indicates process, something more valuable than the results. Thank you for listening.
Organizational deviation threatens humanity in Moby Dick. Moby Dick by Herman Melville as a novel hinting at organizational abusing of humanity has been analyzed by Barthes' literary codes for explaining the motive of blind subordination of subordinates. This presentation explored the sincere hope of a true spiritual and political fellowship of mankind, chastened nevertheless by the awareness that such a fellowship always remains at risk of being sacrificed, exploited, even exterminated by blindness of vision, violence, and greed of a small minority in position of decision-making. The tragedy of Moby Dick in its depiction of failure of vision and action constellate a violent and seemingly unavoidable tragic flaw. Subordinates like Queequeg and Ishmael are unable to notice the fatal destination of their futile pursuit and devise any martial resistance towards Ahab's tyranny, even at a critical moment. In this approach, strategies that subordinates can implement towards malicious decision makers like Ahab have been extracted from human side of organizational principles, and the excavation has been eased by Barthes' literary codes, which are proetic, hermeneutic, cultural, semantic, and symbolic. The malicious decision makers have been categorized as clueless, split personality, hoarders, intimidators, players of mind games, and perfectionists, and the strategies to cope with these weak decision makers have been analyzed in characters in order to discern the causes of the tragic flaw. The role of eco-critical approach is vital in this interdisciplinary viewpoint because anthropocentrism is a big threat that ends up to natural abuse. The whale, as the epitome of nature, defeated Captain Ahab to be a good example for those who wish to conquer nature in a futile effort. Now the codes, the proetic code. This code is also termed as the narrative code to refer to those elements of a narrative which create tension in its plot. These suspensive elements play dual roles in a text. At first, they proclaim that something is going to happen. Secondly, they make the reader attentive and respondent to resolve the tension. Here, the reader tries to get an advanced knowledge about the actions by asking some of the questions as what will be the reaction to a certain action. The hermeneutic code. The hermeneutic code is also, as the code of enigma, refers to all the enigmatic, puzzling, and mysterious elements of a text that make reader curious to unveil their mystery. Here, the reader tends to disclose certain secrets by asking several questions of one's knowledge as what is happening and why is that happening? What's the obstacle? Hermeneutic codes consist of snare, equivocations, partial answers, and jammings. The term snare implies deliberate evasion of truth. The word equivocation refers to the mixture of truth and a snare, and the term jamming stands for acknowledgement of insolubility. About peroratic and hermeneutic codes dependent on two sequential codes, the revelation of truth and the coordination of the actions represented, there is the same constraint in the gradual order of melody and in the equally gradual order of narrative sequence. These two codes work together to develop the plot of a narrative. The peroratic code helps the reader to understand the chronological sequence of an action and its reaction, and the hermeneutic code enables the reader to resolve the puzzling and equivocal scenes. The implementation of these two codes let the reader recognize the essence of the plot. The semantic code. The semantic code, as termed the connotative code, refers to those elements of a text which can be better understood by implying their suggestive and connotative meanings. All narratives have some definite characters, places, and objects that connotatively help the reader to understand the theme of the text. The symbolic code. The symbolic code as antithetical code to resemble the semantic code, and thence it creates difficulty for the readers to make a clear distinction between semic and symbolic codes. It is not always clear in the distinction between these two codes. The code refers to the antithetical and contrasted elements of the text by which the reader tries to organize the reality. Through this code, the reader focuses on the binary polarities. And the last one, the cultural code. This code is, as a referential code, pertains to those elements which share a common knowledge of the world. Here, the reader focuses on the physical, physiological, medical, psychological, literary, and historical properties of characters of the story to identify a common knowledge. Now, these codes are applied in Moby Dick. The peroratic code in Moby Dick. Ishmael, who turned to the sea for meaning, is inviting the reader to listen to a story of a voyage. He gradually, during encounters with the whale, became aware of the fact that Ahab had lost his mind and had become too obsessive with the whale. But he did not show any firm resistance towards such a madness. For Ishmael, the reason for starting the journey was no attraction for him on land anymore, and preferring to be paid rather than to pay for his traveling. Ahab's character, to be enigmatic and full of pain, is another code of this kind that invites the reader to discover his intentions. He does not care to pay any cost. All the crew has to pay for the sake of a personal revenge. To introduce Pequod as an organization for the business of whale hunting is another peroratic code. Ishmael and the crew joined Ahab for economic reasons in order to slaughter whales for their oils and other benefits. Ahab, as a malicious decision maker, diverted the energy of his crew to a destructive, life-threatening sea journey. Hermeneutic codes in Moby Dick. Ishmael to be saved in the last encounter by Coffin is the solution to the basic enigma of the futile fight with nature. It seems the only chance of survival for those who wish to conquer nature with its wild forces is to choose a state of dying and surrendering. Ishmael did not choose to continue the fight with a force which was beyond his abilities, and by evading that force, he was able to save his life. It seems it is more congruent with common sense to accept the pure energy of being and to accord with it. Another solution to the enigma of destructive pursuit of Ahab is according oneself to the will of God, as Jonah did. He was able to escape from his whale prison by asking for help from God in whatever ways God chose to be better, for God to be able to choose for him despite his sins of not speaking the truth, because Jonah had a sin of not speaking the truth. creating a spiral of silence for others by not speaking the truth was the great sin that Jonah committed. It seems the crew of Pequot committed the same sin by not speaking the truth about Ahab's vicious plans for personal revenge and deserved to be punished. The semantic code in Moby Dick. The connotative meaning of a group of people who work for the same goal of hunting a whale can be referred to the type of human endeavors that have been performed to go beyond their limits in controlling nature. Human beings are forces within nature, and their energies should be executed in directions that are in accord with the flow of the river of being. To move against the trend of nature has been destructive, and Ahab was the one who lost his life, and not the white whale. The ideological talks between Ishmael and Queequeg and their relationship is another semantic code that refers to having patience towards other people's ideological beliefs. A belief has been considered bearable to the extent that it does not injure other people. The symbolic code in Moby Dick. The crew of Moby Dick, ruled by Ahab, is a symbol of an organization that has been directed by a malicious decision maker. Ahab has had defined characteristics of a malicious decision maker, which are clueless, split personality, hoarder, workaholic. Pequot, as a symbol of a malicious organization, is heading towards destroying itself by abusing nature and can foresee the destiny of any organization of this type. Queequeg is a symbol of victims who had a kind heart, but was used as a sacrificial goat in fighting nature. The last one, the cultural code in Moby Dick. The reason that an organization has been shaped around Ahab for hunting whale is the economic concern of subordinates and the other shareholders. Pequot crew do not care for personal concerns of Ahab in taking revenge from the sperm whale. However, they were the ones who were led to destruction by having just economic concerns. It implies the prime importance of having a clear mindset of the goals and requirements of an organization before joining one on the part of subordinates. The business of hunting whale has been criticized by Melville by his masterpiece because emphasizing on its whiteness is intentional. It is suggested to people to devise other ways for satisfying their needs and do not lead other creatures to the point of extinction. And two other points, the human side of organizations. Ishmael, as a symbol of subordinates in organizations, was financially weak because, as he mentioned in the first chapter, he had no concern for the quality of the room to reside in, but for the price. To work for 3 years in Pequot, to be paid just to have food and clothes is another sign of his weak financial status. It seems subordinates like Ishmael and Queequeg, who are poor and aimless, are the real helping hands of malicious organizations. Structural support of the young and the poor by providing humanistic working conditions can cut the hand of organizations that reach out to abuse nature and other human beings. It is much more evident that by weakening the financial status of people, they are more adept for joining inhuman organizations. Ahab was considered an unconquerable captain and was looking at the ocean in an erect posture to be godlike. He was so proud of himself to mention that, as there is only one God ruling the earth, there is only one ruler of Pequot. Ahab demonstrated emotional reactions to the death of Starbuck for not being able to hug his wife and child again. This show-off of sympathy has been quite superficial and misleading because Ahab has been the cause. Ahab has been asserted to have his humanity. In fact, for his cause, humanity can be sacrificed. He said he would strike the sun if it insulted him, and this sick heart has wishes to kill the white whale, whose whiteness is a symbol of gladness and purity. And the resulting ideas I have mentioned here, the white whale symbolizes the pure essential energy of being that makes this world go round in accord with its natural divine essence and its inherent potential. Malicious decision makers like Ahab are sadistic extremists that do not understand the power of this pure energy and wish to suppress as much as possible this pure, valuable energy for personal advantages or relieving their complexities. Although sailors continued extracting oil by killing whales as a business, but at last the pure energy of being suffocated the most revengeful of them and pulled Ahab to the bottom of the ocean. It seems the divine energy of being have a level of tolerance towards these abusing behaviors, and when run out of patience, would vanish them into the thin air. The subordinates that follow these decision makers are energized by hollow, revengeful, and emotional mottos of a deviated organization to their ultimate destruction. Ahab, as a symbol of a deviated organization, put his subordinates in a vicious circle of destruction from which only those like Ishmael that quit supporting him could have saved their lives. Thank you very much.